Hello, my name is Judith Bruce, and I'm here with my colleague Vera David, and thanks to Naquan Davis. We are conducting a bit of an experiment here to create an online resource for those of you who want to direct resources to the poorest girls in the poorest communities. And this series of lectures covers really the different points in the process of both learning about girls, building a strong case, linking that to the realities of their lives at the community level, developing a business plan with partners, and executing with conscious intentionality and observation. Before beginning, I thought it was important to establish why it's important we act now and, in effect, who we are. This is a moment of shifting and declining resources in the world, in some respects. Disruption, conflict, climate-based, and other emergencies. These emergencies are making the realities of a very high proportion of those, particularly in the poorest countries, very uncertain. It is therefore an urgent moment in which to catalyze efforts to focus attention on the largest, most excluded vital population to the achievement of global compacts. We would say the poorest girls in the poorest communities are that population. We need to direct resources to those at the greatest risk of the most extreme human rights abuses at the youngest ages. In most cases, in most settings, this will lead us directly to the poorest girls, the girls beginning around age 10 in the poorest communities. Who are we? Well, some of you undoubtedly are advocates, and we need advocacy, but we have to shift the focus of our activity closer to Earth. We have much advocacy at 100,000 feet in a global campaign supporting us. It is admirable and vivid and visual. We're coming even closer to Earth as we map where girls are and actually reached and drive resources toward them. We are the people that need to close the gap between the codified promises to girls, the reach of the poorest girls in the poorest communities, to their rights and entitlements. This graphic gives you some picture of what's on our minds. At the very top is the enabling environment, the promises, and the session of today will focus on these promises at the highest levels. Visibility and advocacy, the national voice, those instruments which embody girls' and women's points of view, but still are often located in capital cities and working at a pretty high level of system. And at the bottom, but certainly not at the least important level, at the community-based, where we develop tangible, viewable, huggable, tactile programs that reach girls, platforms where they can gather, find voice, find each other. And in between, what we're calling dedicated structures and programs to deliver health, social, and economic innovations is where some core work needs to be done. We don't have structures of accountability or delivery in this middle level, and these must be both subnationally and community level focused. They may live within the compacts nationally, but these structures of delivery are the key to innovation. Ideas are a dime a dozen. To bring this one to Earth, we need those structures, and we need those structures to be places of participation and voice for girls. We have the fuel, the girls, and how they inspire us, but now we need a plan. This means moving from the right side of our brains, where we are touched and moved by the girls, to the left side, where we use our tough, rigorous intelligence to make a difference. We must move from advocates to implementers and executors. Our fuel is emotion, but it's not our plan. The workshop and this material is for people who agree to hold the contract for girls. There will be unexpected friends along the way. But as Romeo Dallaire writes, warriors are not those with weapons, rather. And he's speaking, I think, here of the Ghanaian contingent in the Rwandan conflict. And he writes so beautifully about it. But this struck me. He said, "They led the way on every front and never wavered. They did not wait for supplies to come to them. If they had, they might have waited forever. They improvised, they bartered, bent the rules, scrounging with the best of them. They shared our ability to make a military silk purse out of a sow's ear. In other words, a warrior is someone who gets something done, and that's who we must be." So moving to the highest level of argument, the 6 reasons on which the world agrees investments in girls are important would be the Millennium Goals, and these are basically domains in which countries have crafted more specific promises to improvements in the following areas: reversing intergenerational poverty, universal primary education, which in the case of adolescent girls is increasingly focused on what happens, in fact, during adolescence. Primary education is important, but skill building during adolescence, which often means secondary school education, is particularly vital at this point. Gender equality and defining the moments when the architecture of both gender norms and access and self-esteem are laid. Reducing maternal mortality and closely related child health. Staunching the increasingly young and persistently female HIV epidemic, and rebalancing the resource population equation. The environmental concern, but linked in this case often also to the role that population plays in demands for resources and their equitable distribution. Adolescent girls sit at the heart of each of these 6 areas. Reason number 1, reversing intergenerational poverty, is really about increasing females' access to and control of resources. That's the theme that was hit even 30 years ago in the beginning of the women's movement. It's a phrase I think originally invented by Bina Agarwal. And it wasn't just access but control, because when females get access, they don't necessarily have control unless there are special measures to support them, because they're so subject to intimidations within the household level. When women have access to and control of resources, this has far stronger returns to human capital, including intergenerational investment, than comparable income in male hands. In the microeconomic studies, those figures go from a dollar in a woman's hand is equal to 10 in a man's hand, and some studies that might even rise to 20. The reason that's important is that females don't get an equitable return on their labor. But yet they often end up supporting households even when their income is less than the male partner or other males in the household. When the council began this work some years ago, there were a couple of building blocks. First was this understanding that the original household models, which assumed that there was some optimization of resources, that there was something called something called a household head, who received resources and equitably distributed them, which hid for women the very distinct cleavages and use of resources that take place within households. We'd invested a lot of time in supporting those who would later do really important microeconomic studies, and the council even produced, I was one of the co-authors, Stanford University Press was the press, a book called Women and Income in the Third World, which made the case across a lot of settings that women were constantly bargaining, sometimes with their fertility, sometimes literally with money, but that the arena of power confrontation for females was the household. Now we're looking at adolescent girls and have to understand that their access to and control of resources, their understanding themselves as economic beings is core. Related to this was the understanding that a very high proportion of girls would support households. As at one point, these were called female-headed households, and they could be seen in the literature where you had a female alone, because whenever a male was present, it was assumed that he was both earning the income, sharing it, and, quote, the head of the household. That was debunked, and again, the council spent a lot of time on that subject in partnership with the International Center for Research on Women. And the latest wave of analysis, which I think is crucial, is to understand that a high and probably rising proportion of adolescent girls alive today across all economies will be substantial or sole supports of themselves. This is often not understood. When we speak about female-supported households, this is seen as a bad thing rather than a normal thing. The bad thing is if they are not prepared. We must also address ourselves to where the costs of children are located, and the failure to hold fathers accountable for their fair share of their children's costs is, I think, a long-term driver of female poverty. But the point I'm making here is that these poorest girls are the girls that are going to have to carry economies forward. They are the girls who are going to have to make investments that create a rising middle class, that create trained workers and consumers of goods. Some of the returns to girls, the returns to education of girls are well known, so I'll dwell very little on this. This slide has some projections of what would be gained if we not only educated girls up to the level that they're meant to be educated, but then employed them at levels comparable to males with equal returns to their education. I want to simply stress, I think the original finding, Larry Summers is associated with at the World Bank, that an extra year in school confers on girls as much as a 20% gain in her income for each year. Suffice it to say, it's both a right and a necessity, but it's often not enough. We need to explicitly support girls' understanding that they're economic actors and preparing them for decent livelihoods. Giving girls assets and preparing them for decent livelihoods intercepts poverty where it begins. Both girls who may live with the fantasy that they're going to find someone who's going to support them, even though they've never seen that. They may be in a community in which the female at home with a male providing all the income has never been seen. Nonetheless, the fantasies in the modern media continue to drive this, as do traditional concepts of male superiority. But the fact is that all girls are like Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz. They've got red shoes on. They're already making contributions. We have to help them recognize that and increase their capacities because they're going to be supporting themselves and their family. The planners need to know this too because they are imagining, I think, a model of change which works through male employment, not female employment. And there's a kind of systematic, I think, misunderstanding of the fact that the poorest and least of them, at least to our eyes, are actually the vital engines of change. We thought to revisit the data on female-supported households by asking Shelley Clark, a wonderful demographic analyst, to review, using current data, the chances of a girl becoming a single mother from either widowhood or divorce in 4 African countries, and now we're going to tackle another few. The range we found was between 30 and 70%, using a very conservative estimate of being a single mother between the ages of 15 and 49. These numbers are not small, and the consequences are not insignificant. Failing to invest in these girls is, in effect, planned poverty. This is the graphic which shows you the projections for these 4 African countries. The lowest one is Ethiopia at 30%. And the highest is Zimbabwe at 70%, Malawi and Kenya up there around almost 60%. So under present circumstances, and I think likely increasing, these are girls who will certainly face being on their own as a mother, either because they had a child without a partner present or because they became divorced or widowed, or all of those things. And with the exception of Kenya, more of the single motherhood arises from divorce and widowhood because child marriage, as I call it, not early marriage, but child marriage, confers a really strong lifetime disadvantage, both because of age differences between partners and the weak power position of the girls in their basically forced marriages. Failure to invest in these 40% of girls is a plan to make a country poor. One of the interesting findings is that those girls, the percent of girls who've experienced single motherhood is more likely in areas where there's high levels of child marriage, and the relationships are now being found between single motherhood and really fascinating and troubling levels of child mortality. It appears that being a single mother at some point is like a permanent lowering of your human stock, so that even if you are currently, quote unquote, in a relationship which is constructed as marriage, the fact that you have been a single mother carries with it economic and social penalties forward. Second reason, this is the second Millennium Goal, has to do with education. Girls' education and levels of participation during adolescence is the best development investment. This is said over and over again. Some of the benefits, the immediate benefits, are attendance in formal school during adolescence is correlated with delayed sexual initiation, later marriage and childbearing, lower rates of HIV and AIDS, enhanced social status, greater gender equality. School uniform, it says here, marks a girls as sexually unavailable. I think that's probably an overstatement, but even though we certainly face many problems of girls being in school, being sexually exploited, the level of sexual activity of girls outside of school is higher. Future benefits. Educated mothers bring benefits to their children, safer health and hygiene practices, better nutrition, more time and resources for children's health and education. They've improved earning potential, increases in household income. Women have better bargaining power within households, greater ability to act on preferences for investments in children, especially high returns to investments in girls' education. Civic participation. Girls make contributions to economic and social development of their communities, nations, leading to improvements in gender equality and reduction of poverty. There's no way we can fault girls' education. And a girl being in school during adolescence, whether it's way behind grade for age or poor quality, is still better than her being out of school because it gives her an anchor, and my own feeling is it gives her a great social capital base. But it's not enough. And these are data that my colleagues have developed from Malawi, and I should give the acknowledgement that, probably the best summary of the value of girls' education and some of the recent findings, our colleague Cynthia Lloyd, in a piece called New Lessons, which is part of the Girls Count series, reviews, including some new tabulations of the proportion of girls by country who are in school at age 12 and at age 15, because you want to know where they are by a certain age, not just that they're enrolled. Now, turning to some of the things we have to really pay attention to, our colleagues who did a longitudinal study in Malawi of males and females found that after school leaving, females lost their knowledge much more rapidly than males. So these are what are called the survival functions for literacy. And on one side is the local language, Chichewa, and on the other side is English. And I need to credit my colleagues, including Barbara Mensch, for leading this extraordinary work. It's an amazing data set. And now if we look at numeracy, we see similar declines in math and money problems, with the boys having some declines, but the girls are much more extreme. And one of the findings also was that girls who were not in school were sometimes just as numerate as girls in school because they had to cope with the moneyed economy. One of the deficits in school being the lack of preparation for an economic life. Girls might think of themselves as in school because someone might take care of them. But in any case, school alone is not preparing them. So the next set of things we need to do is look at what we can do on the social capital side to support girls getting to school on time, staying there, having places to study, having people to practice with, creating a team of learning partners, and later, as they get older, imagine a 15-year-old girl in a financial literacy program in a community, she can really begin to plan with others her value chain. It's very difficult for an individual female to succeed economically. They need a team, and what I think we see in these data are the boys are using English more than girls because they can get out there, and in this case, boys can get in the economy more than girls can, and what facilitates their access to the economy is not necessarily their book learning, but the social capital they've accrued and then they can deploy to find their way safely into economies. Reason number 3, we must reach girls early, and if we're to reset norms that both they carry and boys carry, arising as we investigate the proportion of girls who have experienced sexual violence, different kinds of abuse, we find, as the records get better, an extremely high proportion takes place under the age of 15. In fact, around the time of puberty, which unfortunately coincides with the transition from primary to secondary school, girls seem to be particularly vulnerable. They also seem to internalize very negative gender norms, perhaps as a defense mechanism against an unsafe world. One of our colleagues, Kelly Holman, has recently mapped access to the world for 8-year-old girls and 8-year-old boys. This is in South Africa, and they're pretty similar. This is pre-puberty. Once you get to 15-year-old girls and 15-year-old boys, and this is measurable quantitatively, the girls' world has shrunk to a very small area. So they not only can they can move around much less at the time in many fewer places. This contraction of the world is basically what they must do, because anything that happens in this negative is seen as their fault. Therefore, we must work at a very early age with girls to develop their protective assets, and we need to work with them collectively. The individual girl understanding this is not sufficient. More and more research is showing that risks to violence operate at both the individual level, such as girls with fewer friends are more likely to experience sexual coercion. That's data from South Africa, Kelly's data, but also at the level of the community and the school. Places where many girls have been abused are themselves a factor increasing the possibility of an individual girl not only being abused but accepting that abuse. So we need to think of violence more structurally. It obviously is unacceptable always. The individual consequences are dreadful to the body, to the spirit, but it's also a way to interrupt the social contract, civic participation. Violence impedes girls' access to entitlements, services, facilities, and life. And at the top of this slide are some of the things that are in communities that girls simply can't get to, and they often can't get to them because of gender norms, the threats of violence, and the social idea that if something happens to girls, they are responsible for their safety. A girl who experiences violence somehow was owed it because she didn't color within the lines. The only thing that is working in many communities in terms of delivery of services to girls is, I would say, the Ministry of Violence. It is a systematic disinvestment in all the other investments that have been made. It is not just an issue of access, but safe access, and an internalized sense both of right but specific plans as well. Girls need to know school vacations are dangerous times. Girls need to know that festivals in villages may be times when girls are inducted into unlawful and young marriages. They need specific plans. In general, when people talk about integrated content and services, they imagine at the community level there are a number of things, so that even though services are siloed, it must be that girls, including our disadvantaged girls, have access to a whole range of things. This is not true. The Council, with the support of UNFPA, undertook in a number of countries, and we've got 5 here, and there are another 3 or 4 where this has been done, to look at who is receiving the so-called youth resources. Now, the youth policies already have a problem because they generally begin officially at age 15 and go often as old as 35, and they're very biased, as this data shows you, to serving older populations, particularly older male populations. So if you look at the column that says 20 years or over, 63% of the beneficiaries in Burkina Faso of youth centers, of peer education programs, and so forth are older than 20. I remember one study in Ethiopia where I think it was about a third of the beneficiaries were 25 or over. Then we see another pattern, much more male capture than female capture, with extremes like Mauritania, 83% males versus 17% females. Guatemala looks like an exception, but isn't, in the sense that what the females are getting are not asset building. They're accessing health services often after the fact of a sexual encounter that was unwanted, or a pregnancy. So we have much more detail on these, but the point of it is to look beyond the policies and all of the memorandums of understanding that they should have equal access and discover who is actually capturing the benefits. Let me highlight specifically, and especially age. The youngest females, first of all, aren't captured, and neither are the youngest males in conventional youth policy. For the males, it's less consequential because their puberty doesn't come till 14 or 15 and their world is getting better. But for girls, this is really serious. So only 7%, you can see these very small numbers of the 10 to 14-year-olds. And we need to have, I think, if we're serious about resetting gender norms, to use our current youth, and I would hope renamed adolescent investment, to have stratified access to youth resources by age and gender, so that the younger, more vulnerable girls get their fair share. And there's some of the younger, more vulnerable boys who have been left out as well. Many of these programs basically cater to adult males, creating environments that are hostile to the well-being of other populations. Reason 4. Investments in the poorest girls in the poorest countries are likely to reduce maternal mortality, and this has to do with some historical demographic facts. But maternal mortality is a J-shaped curve. So, moving to some of the reasons, as fertility falls, a rising proportion of births will be first births. Right now, you may have a situation in which the first birth has, let's say, call it level X of elevated maternal risk, and then it drops for births 3 and 2 and 3 and 4, and it's back up at 5. Well, as fewer and fewer births are that later order, a rising proportion of all maternal mortality will be in these younger age groups. So focusing on the youngest first-time mothers is demographically sound. You'll basically get a rising share of the market, no other way to put it. It also allows you to develop good habits early. Many community health workers overlook the young married girl. She's very low in the totem pole. She may even be invisible in the household. Recently, some of my colleagues in Ethiopia presented data which showed that the community health workers were twice as likely to visit married women with an unmet need of over 35 than they were of the very many girls, 15 to 19, who have an unmet need for contraception. So if we get to them early, we can help them establish habits that are positive around the first birth or the first pregnancy, or better yet, delaying the first pregnancy. In Ethiopia, more than half, and in some cases up to 80% of the girls who are contracepting are delaying a first pregnancy. In any case, developing a virtuous lifetime set of habits. Infant feeding choices, crucially spacing through contraception, All these tend to be carried forward, as well as relationships. We get lots of reports. We anchored programs around these very young women, that relationships with husbands improve, husbands being drawn in at the invitation only. You don't force the males into it unless the females want it. But when they want that participation, it can be very helpful. And you also improve the health system, because any time you make a health provider aware of the social context and configurations and the need to establish a dialogue over what actually happens in the household, it will carry forward. So, for example, a program that gave special attention to the lack of control over certainly sexuality, the pressure for fertility, the relative ignorance, they're younger, they're low power in the household. If a health system starts really responding to them, that sensitivity to the power relationships between males and females in the household can only help the health system get better. It doesn't matter if they then apply it to older populations. It's important there too. And inertia's on our side. But right now we have health systems that get very technocratically focused and often around new technologies, so that success looks like delivering technology X rather than assisting females in achieving their reproductive and health intentions. My colleague Anru Jain came up with the HARI index, and this index, rather than measure how many people use contraceptives, measures how many of the clients got what they said they wanted. I want to have a child. Did they have one? I want not to have a child. Did they not have one? I have a reproductive tract infection. Was it cleared up? So this investment in the younger populations, I think, will also help us reform the health systems and the metrics that underpin them. Reason 5, the HIV epidemic. This epidemic was viewed initially as more male than female, then it became a balance of female and male, and then it very quickly became increasingly young and persistently female. Typical new incident case ratios for those aged 15 to 24 across sub-Saharan Africa are 3-to-1, female to male. And in some countries and in some communities, they're reporting 5-to-1 and 8-to-1. Without dedicated prevention, mitigation, and treatment efforts, marginalized and young females are likely to bear a disproportionate share of HIV infection. And what is astounding to me is, with all the efforts that have gone into HIV all these years, if you had a strategy, let's say you were selling Coke, and there was a group you never, ever managed to reach, wouldn't you change your strategies? But they persistently stick with the old way of doing things. We are not reaching these girls, and there's a way to do that. We've suggested that rather than take this sort of pathological core transmitter approach, which is too narrow, nor the do everything for every female approach, that there being some selection, some use of available data to identify geographic concentrations of girls at exceptional risk. There are places in countries where there are higher risk. There are places where the sentinel sites show higher levels. Go to those places and make special investments in the young females in those places. Develop social infrastructure for adolescent girls. A protective asset in and of itself, just having friends, is already a plus. It has benefits. It has epidemiologically measurable benefits, as well as providing a platform. We need to reframe for other things. Imagine if we get an HIV vaccine, just as now the exact application of the HPV vaccine, we're puzzled because we don't actually have suitable places to reach many of the girls at the highest risk, which is the girls out of school. We need to reframe current investments to respond to girls' needs and engage their talents, provide programs for girls in unsafe and underage work, like those in domestic service, and a high proportion may be migrant, eliminate child marriage, the now proven elevated risk of child marriage under 18 in high HIV zones elevates the risk both directly and because of the instability of those relationships. So girls get into and out of, in the case of Ethiopia, when we first began the work, I think it was 12% of the girls by age 20 had been in and out of marriages. Need to make schools safer. Create spaces where girls can meet with other girls and learn teachers' codes and basically feel a sense of community in what can be a threatening environment, particularly for those who've just made the transition from primary to secondary school, where they may be especially predated upon. We need to reach girls in the critical puberty period with community-based health initiatives, how they feel comfortable with, some ownership of their body, and some base with others, some peers to develop protection strategies. Dedicate sessions for girls in youth programming. You saw in the earlier material that girls are systematically excluded, particularly young girls, from access to youth resources. So imagine allocating those resources in the ratio of, let's say, female to male HIV infection. So if you were in a place where female to male HIV infection among those 15 to 24 was 5-1, perhaps perhaps 5 times as many slots should be available for young disadvantaged females than older male populations in youth programs of different kinds. And we need to increase access to services and opportunities through a financial, social safety net, and health skills education. Financial literacy is a great intervention and great content. Again, from South Africa, Kelly Hallman and her colleagues found that girls with a financial goal were much more likely to realistically assess their HIV risk and be tested. Similar results in terms of reproductive health, risk-taking, and clear perceptions and agent actions were found in Kenya. Our colleagues Karen Austrian and others. It's a pretty consistent link. We know where to find the girls, and we know what to do. We really want to turn HIV around. This is unfinished business. Reason 6. The 7th billion person was born on October 31st, 2011. Investment in girls is the most strategic tool we have to rebalance the resource population equation. It has always been a good idea to invest in females. There has always been a link in the population literature, but that link is getting stronger and stronger as fertility falls, and as the issue of the age structure as a driver, population momentum of population increases. Investment in the poorest girls in the poorest communities could significantly increase their productive capacity, reshape and redistribute the dependency burden, increase the space between generations, and foster reductions in the rate of population growth. This is a win, 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 win. John Bongartz and I collaborated on an article called The New Population Challenge, where we lay this out, and he has brilliantly created this population decomposition exercise, which helps people see the relative weight of different factors in increasing population size. This is Ethiopia's, and it notes that about 41% of future population growth in Ethiopia is attributable to population momentum, the young age structure. Part of that you can't change, but part of it you can, which is to increase the age at which girls have their first child. In Bangladesh, the momentum, I think, is responsible for about 80% of future population growth. And one of their great challenges is they brought contraceptive uses very high, and even long-term fertility goals are not terribly high, but the fact that girls are having babies at 18 is a problem. In any case, if we invest in girls in ways that allow them to delay marriage and childbearing, that's one input, both to them and to the age structure, increasing the space between generations. Investments in these girls decreases their need for large families of security, so their desired family size is lower, and as they marry later, they will be having their first child later, so they structurally can't have the high numbers, and they will be much less likely to want them. These investments increase girls' ability to adopt health-seeking behaviors, including protection from HIV, effective contraceptive use, and safer maternity practices, and ability to bargain with partners. Much of unmet need is not about absence of services, though it can be a problem, but about the low bargaining power for women who want to contracept and have such low power in their relationships, and this is worse if they have been married very young and there's an age gap. Their power is so low that they will say that they aren't using contraception because their husband doesn't agree, and if you ask them, have you asked your husband, they say no. They literally just anticipate and yield, and that is itself an indicator of the lowest power, the inability to even raise an issue. And the fourth big reward of investments in girls with population returns is that it empowers vital intergenerational investment in children, especially girls' education, and there's increasing evidence that not only is female income used on behalf of others to sort of steward the development of others, but there are especially high returns to girl children. That sets in train a virtuous cycle. These are some decomposition exercises for other countries, and you can find that the Population Council has a site, and I believe UNFPA now, where you can get all the population decompositions for, I think, 50 plus countries. In any case, Rwanda, if you did an average delay in childbirth of 5 years, you would directly avert 34% of projected population growth. In Kenya, that figure would be 35%. In Nigeria, it would be a whopping 40%, and I think if you segregated the North from the South, it probably would be higher in terms of a return. Also, so summing up on this, investing in poor girls so they may hold on to their childhood and delay childbearing by 5 years from present levels is a good in and of itself. Everything we would do, schooling, social support, creating places where girls can meet, relieving girls from some of their tedious work burden, keeping them safe, helping them, giving them personal documentation and making them feel part of society. All these are good things to do, but it also could reduce projected population increase in the least developed countries by, and I think the new figure is 39%, but at least 37%, or about 300 million. And that is the direct reduction. Then indirectly, it affects all the other parts of all the other factors driving population growth. I can't resist including one more thought here because it's a big investment opportunity. There's new interest in family planning. They call it the golden moment. There was a family planning summit in July 2012. We've done some analyses. We did actually for the summit to look at places where we could co-locate investments in subnational regions. Let's take Amhara in Ethiopia as an example, where you have a high proportion of girls that are married under age 18, 55% or more, and at least 10% under 15. So places where you have a very severe epidemic with a special interest in where it's the youngest epidemic, because that's where you have the most severe consequences and dislocation. Now, there are places that have that feature. They also have high proportions of girls, 15 to 19 and 20 to 24. They have a higher than regional and national average of unmet need, meaning that they are, as a group, they are saying, we want contraception, let's say 30% of us, whereas across all women 15 to 49, only 22% say they have an unmet need for contraception. This goes against the grain. People don't think of young populations this way, and they haven't thought about the real potential of reaching these girls. We have in Ethiopia now programs operating at scale, married girls clubs, and the vast majority of the girls who are, first of all, between about 65 and 75% of the girls are contracepting, and the vast majority of them are delaying a first birth. And that is simply a social intervention. It's not about new services. It's creating social capital and a demand creation and social support system. Here are some places in sub-Saharan Africa where and Asia, you see I have more countries here, where both of these conditions apply. Democratic Republic of the Congo and Equator, Malawi in the Southern District, Niger, Dosso and Tilaberi, Bangladesh, Chittagong and Dhaka, India, Jharkhand, Bihar, Rajasthan. Places where we want to make investments anyway, but this would be an important opportunity, thinking of the rationale of saying we can go there and build a social infrastructure that reaches the 10 to, let's say, 22-year-old age group, and simultaneously work on the dreadful child marriage epidemic on the one hand, so stopping the train, stopping those girls from being married, and then also support the girls who have crossed this dreadful finish line into marriage, underage marriage, who want to contracept and want to secure their reproductive health and the health of their children. One infrastructure could do both, so one investment with two very closely interrelated goals. This is a map of Ethiopia which shows what parts of Ethiopia, what districts, more than 25% of those are currently 2024 were married under age 18. This is the U.S. government standard. Ours is generally more demanding. And then we have on the other side the unmet needs. So, for example, in Amhara, 32.6% of the 15 to 19-year-olds married say that they have an unmet need, as compared to the average, which is 25.3%. That's much higher and obviously strategically significant to get to 15 to 19-year-olds rather than to 35-year-olds with unmet need. They'll all have rights. And then in this map, we phase out just the places with child marriage and show the places where we have both high levels of child marriage and places where there's exceptional levels of unmet need in young female populations. Now, I want to sum up before one last thought. Girls work both sides of this equation. Let's focus for a moment on what that means. In the denominator, the investments in girls that are goods in and of themselves, that are unambiguously good things to do, education, social support, personal documentation, financial literacy, all these things that help them have control and be able to have relationships and children later, result in delayed childbearing, and that reduces the dependency burden by increasing age at first birth and increasing often the spaces between births and the overall family size, and reducing the demand for the poverty-driven demand for children. People love and want children, but having them because they think that's the only way you can have a life or a living. When that changes, then the numbers come down, the space between generations increases, society becomes more manageable. At the same time, the investments that you're undertaking to do that, to achieve that end, increase the economic pie. We have all these young females now with financial literacy and other kinds of skills, with more schooling, with a base, with other females with which they can create new value chains and, as observed, more equitable value chains. So we increase productive capacity and expand economic participation and intergenerational investment. We basically lift up the bottom 40% of girls, and they in turn lift us up. So the denominator, the draw on resources, decreases, and the volume of resources on the top increases. This is the last reason to invest in girls. This is the first picture I've shown you of a girl, because the point of the talk today was that we have to turn our passion about these girls into a plan. But that doesn't mean our passion isn't important and well-grounded. The last reason to invest in girls is that they know what's happening to them. The pain is indivisible. You aren't halfway hungry, you're hungry. Your neighbor being hungry doesn't make you hungry. The pain that they are often in palpably day to day, and they still struggle and don't lose hope. I remember one of the girls involved in our program in Ethiopia, who was, I guess, about 15, said, don't you know what we have to do to live? And I was a little unclear, and then she said, all we want are underpants and a savings account. And the underpants are because she felt dirty. This is a girl who was getting herself twice a week to a girls' meeting group, and she wanted that, both maybe for the management of her hygiene, but also just because she felt every day that she didn't have underpants badly. And she wanted a savings account because she was a strong and sophisticated girl, and even though she wasn't literate, she knew that the age at which you could get a savings account was 14. She felt what she was going through. She could communicate it. When I began my work, I guess quietly hoped that it was hard for me initially to look at poverty and suffering of others. It still is. It was harder knowing how deeply and daily it's experienced. And I was in Pakistan, in the northern frontier area, a group of nomadic women. My friend was translating for me, and I said, "Tell me about your life." And she said, "We're like the dust. They step on us all day long." So clear, so brave, so present. So that burden of grief and that burden of abuse is there. The highest concentration of abuse, I think, is probably concentrated on this young female population. I would even say something else. The young female body, its work capacity, its sexuality, its fertility, is being used and harnessed by others other than these girls. It is commercially valuable. Drug cartels are moving into girls' bodies in preference to drugs because it's a renewable resource and because the population is so compromised and has internalized such stigma and has had so few ways out. So we must look at the globe and allow ourselves to see, in some moments, this massive, unjustifiable, and unproductive exploitation of girls and the failure to support them at this crucial moment, this young moment when they can come alive. The protection of 600 million girls' human rights is a moral imperative, and I hope you will dedicate yourselves to that. Thank you. I hope it was fun.